and thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm Alex Fallon. I'm the Executive Director of the Carmel Public Library Foundation, and you can see that this is a very popular program, so I'm taking mental notes for next year. And before we begin, I'd like to introduce our board president, Ben Heinrich, to say a few words about the foundation, and then we'll get straight to the program.
Good evening. What a wonderful turnout. Before we get started, please make sure that your cell phones are all turned off. Thank you. For more than a century, the Carmel Public Library has been a treasured cultural center for our community, offering free programs, services, library collections to more than 112,000 patrons and visitors every year. The Carmel Public Library Foundation was founded to raise the funds to operate the library. Our mission is to keep the library open, relevant, and thriving, and to ensure free library services in perpetuity by providing funds for 100% of the books, materials, programs, equipment, and services, all funded by charitable donations from people like you. And we thank you. The Carmel Public Library Foundation, as well as colleagues like Friends of the Library, makes providing all the library services possible. And your gifts have an enduring impact. So a quick word about giving. Please consider making an annual donation if you haven't already done so. Any amount is appreciated. Contributors who give an annual amount of $100 are invited to our library celebration, our donor salute, which is held in the spring. It's a very special community event, our way of sharing our appreciation. We hope to see you all at this fun and popular event next spring, because you are the reason our library is open and thriving. Also, please note that this year's fundraiser is known as the Travel Edition, featuring acclaimed travel writer Pico Iyer, renowned novelist and essayist for his unique cultural commentary, and Don George, editor-at-large and columnist for National Geographic Traveler and editor of BBC's Travels Words and Wanderlust. The program will be held April 24th, and tickets are on sale at sunsetcenter.org. Now for our program. Historically, veiling is a tradition that is common to all Abrahamic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. One need look no further than the traditional bridal veil to see the remnants of what was once a common practice of modesty. Given that only traces of the tradition remain in Christianity and Orthodox Judaism, we most often associate veiling with Islam today. And many Americans misunderstand why veiling is prevalent in the Middle East and why a woman might choose to wear a veil. Dr. Irwin will explore how the complexities of veiling in Islamic societies vary within religious, cultural, and political contexts, and in comparison to the traditions of veiling in Muslim American communities. Please welcome Dr. Bonnie Irwin.
And link this back to libraries in a strange way. We seem to be obsessed with women's hair all over the world, particularly in American culture, though. I think most of us in the audience are of an age that you have seen at least one Hollywood film where there's a librarian and her hair's up and she's got glasses on. And there's that scene where the glasses come off and she does this, right? And as I was preparing this and remembering it was to raise funds for the Library Foundation, I was like, I thought I'd start with that little joke. So, formal start of the presentation, one of my favorite poets is an Arab-American woman by the name of Moja Kaf. And she's written several poems. Most of them are relatively short. I'm going to read a couple this evening. And the first one is called Hijab, Scene Number 3. Would you like to join the PTA, she asked, tapping her clipboard with her pen. I would, I said, but it was no good. She wasn't seeing me. Would you like to join the PTA, she repeated. I would, I said, but I could have been antimatter. A regular American mother next to me shrugged and shook her head. I would. I sent up flares, beat on drums, waved Navy flags, tried smoke signals, American Sign Language, Morse code, Western Union, telex, fax. Lieutenant Uhuru tried hailing her for me on another frequency. Damn it, Jim, I'm a Muslim woman, not a Klingon. But the positromic force field of hijab jammed all her cosmic coordinates. Can we save the ship we're both on? Can we save the dilithium crystals? So this idea of why a woman might wear a veil, what the veiling means, what it is, we're going to look at a number of those things this evening. There were 3 women in veils that hit the news media in 2016. First one I'd like to talk about very briefly is a woman by the name of Ghazala Khan. You probably recognize this photo. She spoke at the Democratic Convention. She's a Gold Star mother. And a lot of people got on Donald Trump's case for some seemingly insensitive things he said about making assumptions about the fact that this woman was oppressed. She's standing behind her husband. And while there may be, and I'm going to put my politics on my sleeve here, many things that I am not happy with Donald Trump about, this one I kind of shrugged my shoulders and said, I don't think he's different than too many other people. But Mrs. Khan said, my religion teaches me that all human beings are equal in God's eyes. Husband and wife are part of each other. You should love and respect each other so you can take care of the family. When Donald Trump is talking about Islam, he's ignorant. If he studied the real Islam in the Quran, all the ideas he gets from terrorists would change because terrorism is a different religion. And she goes on to talk about, the fact that she wears a veil and it's her choice. And this is one of the things I'm going to keep coming back to tonight is choice. And what are those choices? The burkini made news in France. They were trying to decide whether they should outlaw this or not. Her head is covered. Her hair is covered. Arguably, you can still see the shape of her figure, so maybe, maybe not. But this was another, is this really veiling? Not sure. And someone became a saint. We've seen this woman a lot in a veil and not really questioned it because, again, as part of a religious order, we just kind of take it in stride. But it's seen, I would argue, in a different light. So what do we mean when we say veil? There are almost as many types and names for this as there are different countries where it is common. So we have some terms. I'm going to show you examples of hijab, chador, niqab, burqa, abaya, and khimar. This is not everything, but it's a lot of it. This is not a super clear slide, but it gives you kind of an overview of what several of these are, but I have some better photos here. Hijab. So hijab is just a generic term that means covering. And so it is the most common term that's used in Islam to refer to any kind of veiling, saying hijab. The chador, most associated with Iran, although we also see it in Pakistan and some other places. They don't have to be black, but most of the ones we see are. Covers the head and the body, very voluminous. You might wonder about this because, aren't they really, really hot? It is a very lightweight fabric that a chador is made out of, but it is indeed black. And depending on how strict one is, we can see sort of the ankles of this woman here on the end, and that sometimes in certain points in history was not really even noticed, and other times would be noticed quite readily. A niqab covers the hair and face, but not the eyes. I'm going to talk about the Quran a little bit later and talk about whether or not this is what it means based on various interpretations. But this is fairly common as well, where we cover most of the face, but not the eyes. The burqa, on the other hand, is a full covering. Now, the part over the face, and particularly the eyes, is mesh, so the women can see out of these, but it's very much a sign that no one is to see in. An abaya is a cloak that's usually worn over other garments. And here we're starting to get a sense of fashion as well. They're not always all black or all monochromatic. There's lots of different things you can do. And then finally the khimar, which is typically just something that covers the head. So the top part of what they're wearing is called a khimar. Although if you look up khimar online, you'll see full-length ones as well. But literally it is just a covering of the head and hair. So what do we think about when we see a woman show up in a veil? So give me a second here. I usually do this in front of a mirror, so it's not going to look good. So if I had showed up this evening like this, I would argue that many of you would make some assumptions about me, about what I believe, and I don't know if I've got all my hair tucked in there, but if I did, some of you who know me well might also think, well, maybe she's undergone cancer treatments. I mean, there are many other reasons that we cover our heads. But when we see women in any kind of veiling or hijab, we often, and by we I'm speaking very generically about Western culture, think about them differently. And they know this. And so a lot of people have commented. I mean, do we make the assumption that a woman is stupid? Do we make the assumption that she's brainwashed, that she's oppressed, that she has not had a choice? This is why I usually don't do that. What do we know about her politics? Is a woman in a veil a radical? Is she a militant? What do we know? Is she very pious? Sometimes she is, sometimes she's not. So Karen Hughes, a U.S. envoy to the Middle East, met with 500 Saudi women, and this was back in 2005, and they startled her because they informed her that they did not see themselves as oppressed. And, you know, Saudi Arabia is the country where, one of the countries where veiling is required if a woman is in company of men who are not related to her. It is a country which is just starting to allow women to drive, so it is seen as a fairly oppressive regime. These women did not see them that, and they went on to tell the American diplomat that they were tired of people assuming that they were oppressed and telling them that they were. So this is part of the complexities of the politics of this, that it's also an East-West divide, and it has a lot to do with our foreign policy. American scholar Sharifa Zuhur, research scholar, once said, "My American colleagues have suggested that I lecture in an abaya to illustrate my remarks about Saudi women. But for some audience members, a huge percentage of my intellectual credibility would vanish." So even though she knows her stuff, that she's a well-known scholar in this area, she was afraid if she turns up in traditional Islamic dress, people will assume that she knows far less about her subject than she actually does. And she also says that a weird false authenticity would be established from a different portion of that same audience. So she makes the argument that, you know, in other circumstances she might wear a veil, but she won't when she's doing an academic presentation. So why do women wear veils? Modesty, a symbol of modesty. Religious requirements, certainly. Political statements, we'll get into this in a little bit more detail. Oftentimes these political statements are against stereotypical Western tradition. It's a statement against, there was an Iranian scholar who coined a term, West toxification. to talk about Western influence in the Middle East, and so the veil was an argument against that. Sometimes people don't do it for religious reasons, but more for family and community standards. Veiling in some areas is more common, say, in small towns and villages, and less in urban areas. It really depends a lot on the country and the region. A lot of women will also say that they do it in order to move about a little bit more freely and work without being victim of what some Muslim women refer to as the staring mafia. So just like any other minority status, so if you're in a country where veiling may not be required, but that most women wear veils, if you are the one or two women who don't, people are going to stare. Just like in this country, if you're one of the handful of women who do, people are going to stare, right? We're always sort of noticing difference and kind of trying to come to terms with that. In some countries, when the regimes have gone secular, we have had the forced removal of veils. And what some families then do is they pull their girls out of school, or they tell their sisters they can't work anymore. So then, is the veil itself oppressive or is it empowerment? So by wearing it, she can go out and she can do everything, but if she doesn't have it on, she can't. Now you might argue that the whole system is problematic, but it's not really about the veil itself. Maliha Massoud, who's a Syrian American who traveled throughout the Middle East, had a veil on, but now she doesn't wear one. And she observes that the veil denies men their usual privilege of discerning whomever they desire. By default, women are in command. So she's talking about women who are veiled, saying women are in command. The female scrutinizes the male. Now, you think about those women in burqas. Huh? Her gaze from behind the anonymity of her face veil, or niqab, is a kind of surveillance that casts her in the dominant position. So let's think about that. So on the one hand, a culture may be requiring that a woman dress that way, but many of these women feel safe and they actually feel empowered by having that to hide behind or stand behind. I wouldn't necessarily argue that they're hiding. It also, you'll hear a lot of Muslim women talk about American obsession with body image, and that particularly a country that requires a burqa or a chador or something like that, women are somewhat more free of body image issues. I meant to mention at the beginning when I was talking about hair, I looked up some statistics. The 2018 projections of the worldwide expenditure on hair care and hair products is $87 billion. So we'll talk about the veiling industry too here in a minute, but there's always economic motivations behind things. Upper and middle class women sometimes wear veils as a sign of privilege. When you look at the history of a veil, it was often more common in urban areas and among the wealthy, because if you think about trying to work in a field, you're not going to have all these layers on. Sometimes you may have your hair covered, but just keep it out of your face, right? So it's not necessarily something that, as we sometimes assume, it's a small town or backward phenomenon. It is often a sign of wealth and a certain degree of power. Interestingly enough, over the course of the past century, the 20th century, in the Middle East particularly, more women have been told to take off the veil than to put it on. So, the veil was first outlawed in Turkey in 1925. So Turkey was one of the first countries in the Middle East to really become more secularized. Government employees were not allowed to wear it, students at public schools and universities. And this law was reinforced again in 2013. So they had made it looser and more women were wearing veils if they chose to or not, but then the government came back in, and there's still a struggle if a woman wants to wear a veil in a public university or public building in Turkey. They were outlawed in Iran under the Shah's father, the Shah we all know who got deposed. His father's the one who outlawed it. In Syria and Iraq in the 20th century, they were banned in public schools. They were banned in Egypt and also became somewhat passé and then came back for political reasons. And then they were in northern Africa. They started thinking seriously about outlawing them in the 60s because there's a film based on an actual event, the Battle of Algiers, where women were smuggling armaments under their veils. So then it becomes, again, this political device, and where do we land? Tunisia, in the 20th century, women were pulled off the street for wearing a veil. Just as in Iran, you were pulled off the street for not after the revolution, but in Tunisia in earlier times in the 20th century, you would actually be removed from public if you were wearing a veil. And then certainly Iraq under Saddam Hussein had outlawed the veil as well. So in Iraq today, you're going to see a mixture. Egypt, you're going to see a mixture, mostly not. Turkey, you're going to see a mixture, mostly not. Iran, you're going to see everyone with their hair covered if they're out in public. Saudi, most everyone. But if you go country by country throughout Muslim nations, you'll find that most do not have laws requiring it. Custom, family traditions, variety of reasons that it may come and go. So, where does it start? Veiling predates Islam, as Ben said in the introduction. We can go even further back and talk about the very first work of literature in the West. The Epic of Gilgamesh has reference to veiling in it. And it's assumed that veiling was brought to Islam from other Mediterranean cultures. In ancient Greece, brides wore veils, ostensibly to ward off evil spirits. So a couple of famous brides of the 20th century, Diana and Jackie Kennedy. Now, interestingly enough, I chose these two not only because they're famous, but obviously Jackie Kennedy's veil is really more symbolic, right? I mean, her whole face is uncovered, most of her hair is covered, but Diana went back to more of a traditional. She really is under a veil. Now, she wasn't like that for the whole day, but when she entered the church, that is what she looked like. But all of this is a holdover from very, very ancient times. So if we go back to the Old Testament, we have from Numbers 5:18, the priest shall, was a test of women's fidelity. The priest shall set the woman before the Lord, dishevel the woman's hair, and place her in her hands the grain offering. This was a test to see if she was among the faithful. But the idea was that it was assumed that her hair was covered, and so to take the test, she would be uncovered. And certainly in the Hasidic tradition today, most women cover their hair. So you'll see whole neighborhoods in New York where Hasidic women cover their hair. I find and I don't know very much about Hasidic Judaism at all, but I find the tradition of covering your hair with hair to be particularly fascinating. I think, and there is a widespread use of wigs among the Hasidim. So I think it's a really interesting way of approaching it. And it certainly wouldn't be the way it would be approached in Islam, because part of the idea is to make yourself look somewhat less attractive. And so hair kind of has effect on that. In the New Testament, we have another reference to veiling, 1 Corinthians. Any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled disgraces her head. It is one and the same thing as having her head shaved. For if a woman will not veil herself, then she should cut off her hair. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or to be shaved, she should wear a veil. So the holdover of that, of course, is our religious orders. And again, I went for the familiar. I love pop culture and couldn't resist a slide of the Flying Nun. But you see, I mean, and again, habits, some are used today, and a lot of people in the orders in Catholicism no longer wear veils, but many do. John Paul II, in his writings in 1996, said, "Since the habit is a sign of consecration, poverty and membership in a particular religious family, I join the fathers of the synod in strongly recommending to men and women religious that they wear their proper habit, suitably adapted to the condition and time and place. So it didn't actually say you had to wear a habit, but that if appropriate, you should have it because it is a sign of your faith and your consecration. So rich cultural history from Judaism and Christianity. Back to Islam. Surah 24 is one of the later surahs in the Quran, and it reads, "And say to the believing women that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty, that they should not display their beauty and ornaments, except what must ordinarily appear thereof, that they should draw their veils over their bosoms and not display their beauty." There is tremendous debate in Islam about what this means really. Because if you look at it, you see should not display their beauty and ornaments, or another way of translating the Arabic word is adornments. This idea that perhaps some Muslim feminists would argue that that doesn't really mean the hair. That means the breasts, that means genital region, it means what ordinarily would be covered. So there's been debate back and forth. Certainly this does not imply that the face should be covered, but then some cultural traditions have mandated that. Surah 24 is one of the later ones to be revealed. It was the 102nd surah out of 114 in the order that it was revealed, meaning that it was revealed after the Hijrah, after the Muslims fled from Mecca to Medina. So you've got a fairly late pronouncement. And just like in Judaism, where the language of the Old Testament is followed up with Talmudic statements, you have the same thing in Islam. The Quran is followed up by various, what we call hadith. The hadith are the words and the actions of the Prophet Muhammad. And so we see more discussion of it there. But if you go all the way back to the source, we go all the way back to the Quran, this is the statement. Here's another translation of the same passage. "And say to ones who are female believers to lower their sight." So modesty is really important. This idea that you shouldn't be staring at someone else, you should be modest. "And keep their private parts safe and not show their adornment, but what is manifest of it." Again, really vague language here. "And let them draw their head covering over their bosoms and not show their adornments." So this seems to be referring more to this idea of the covering that covers the chest as well, sort of the veil that also kind of makes disguises the shape of a woman's body. But as I said, scholars have been debating this back and forth for a long time. So let's look at a couple of kind of case studies of veiling and what has transpired. First, we're going to look at Iran. This is the picture of Shah Reza Pahlavi and his family. You'll notice the women are dressed relatively conservatively, but their hair is not covered. So this is after Iran had become secularized. The Shah's family always dressed rather conservatively, but not with veils. We all go all the way back to the Persian Empire in 500 BC. Veiling there was a status symbol. It was something that the rich and the wealthy did, insofar as common women were forbidden to wear veils, if we go back to the pre-Islamic era. And then it was Italian travelers to Iran in the 16th century wrote that the women were shockingly exposed. Okay, so even after Islam had come, a couple hundred years later, you've got Italians saying, wow, these women are, not nearly as modest as the ones that we see in Europe. But in 1936, the Shah's father of this particular Shah, legally abolished the veil. So 1936 it was abolished because it was seen as backward. And this was a leader who wanted to bring his country up to the modern age and thought that the veil was one of the things that at least symbolically was holding them back. Iran was the first Muslim country to impose Western dress on women. Turkey, when it was going back and forth, was not considered to be an entirely Muslim country at the time. The women who had to undergo that, there's been a lot of interviews of those women, most of them passed away now, but in the day, and they felt naked, they felt shamed. I mean, a lot of my argument about veiling is that we probably should have some choice in the matter, and to force someone to take it off is just as offensive to many people as to force someone to put it on. Theater, restaurant, and hotel owners were ordered not to allow entry to veiled women in the 30s up into the revolution. Ironically, prostitutes had to wear veils unless they were married. I don't quite understand that. Lots of levels of confusion there. But so veiling was seen as, we go from a status thing of the rich to being something that the educated and sophisticated didn't do, to something where you had prostitutes wearing veils and other women not. And it's been a lot of churn. So you can see that even in countries where this is a fairly common practice today, certainly, there's been a lot of evolution and devolution over time. So in 1941, the law was repealed. So it didn't last all that long. But from this era of 1941 to 1978, you had women with veils and women without veils in Iran. And it really was primarily a matter of choice. But in the lead up to the 1979 Cultural Revolution in Islam, proponents of cultural authenticity believed that imperialism had corrupted Iranian women. And so during the Islamic Revolution, the veil found a new political meaning in Iran. No longer a symbol of backwardness and oppression, it now signified resistance. So hundreds of women took to the streets and donned chadors as a political statement. Some of those women did not realize that once the revolution was ostensibly over and the Shah was deposed, they were not going to be able to take that back off. But a lot of women wanted to keep it on, so again, it was a very complex situation. Until that moment of the Iranian Revolution, Saudi Arabia was the only Muslim country that enforced veiling. And so, throughout the Middle East, as late as the 70s, veiling was not required. So on March 8th, 1979, thousands of Iranian women, many of whom had veiled to express this dissent and support of the revolution, marched in the streets in the first of many protests against the veil. So just a few months after they had donned the veil as a political statement, they were in the streets again protesting, and veiled because that was the law, against it. And in those protests, they were often attacked, unfortunately. An interesting side note, the economics of the bazaar. Conservative merchants have annual sales of about $30 million in the chadri fabric, that light black fabric that they make chadors out of, and most of it's imported from Korea and Japan. So, but it is an industry in Iran as well. So, ironies. Shop, restaurants, and hotel owners were ordered not to serve unveiled women. So 40 years before, the law was exactly the opposite. But the veil has also increased the social presence of women from traditional Muslim families, bringing them out of seclusion. Because if you do put the chador on, you go out, you get involved. And so in some of the traditional families, when veiling was not as prevalent, women were kept at home because if they were out in public, people would be staring at them. If they were veiled, people would be seeing too much of them if they were unveiled. So the veiling actually has empowered some of these women from more traditional families, at least in going out and being active in society. Another irony, in 2005, Iran was the third largest consumer of cosmetic products in the Middle East. I think later I have in my slide deck the slide we used to promote this presentation. And a number of people would see that as a contradiction in terms because, okay, you can just see her eyes, right? Her face is covered, but she is heavily made up. It is believed that Iran now has the largest rate of rhinoplasty in the world. And if you think about issues of beauty and body image, if the only thing you have to work with is your face, you're going to spend more time on it, you're going to spend more money on it, you're going to have a different relationship with it. In this country, we can do things with our hair, with our glasses. We've got a variety of things we can do. But if all you have is that oval of your face, you make certain choices. But the sad comment that many people have made in Iran is that those of us in the West have made a big deal about the fact that women were forced to put on veils, and oh, isn't this terrible that these women weren't given a choice. But some of the more conservative women were saying, where were you when we were forced to take it off? And we didn't want to do that either. So it makes us, question our relationship too, and what do? We don't want to see anyone oppressed, but if someone is making a choice for very specific reasons that we may or may not understand, it's a different equation. Example number 2, Afghanistan. The first National Geographic cover here was one of the more famous ones that the National Geographic did at that era. It was 1985. And what did that photo say to us? She looks haunted. She looks afraid. We don't know very much about her. Her face is a little bit dirty, so we assume that she's impoverished. We assume she's a victim of war, but we don't know a whole lot about it. And then the National Geographic went and found her again after 9/11, after all of these things. And so the second photo is from 2003. What does that photo say that's different from the photo in 1985? Same woman. Yeah, she's completely covered, and then she's holding the other picture. And so who is the more haunted woman here, right? The one that we can see into her eyes and she looks frightened and upset, or the one that we have no idea what she's saying or what she's feeling under that burqa? National Geographic has always been kind of seen as a purveyor of truth. Their photos, very accurate. This is telling us what it's really like in another country. And veiling in Afghanistan, again, more urban than rural. Even in Afghanistan, the rural areas, women tend not to be dressed like this if they're out working and doing. It has to comment on women in labor and feudal economy as well. Gayatri Spivak is a very famous feminist scholar, and she talks about situations like this and what they mean, and the political, because when we see that second photo, it makes it a little bit easier for the United States government or any Western power to decide that we need to do something about this. That this woman whose face we used to be able to see is now covered in this burqa, and we need to help. And so Gayatri Spivak, and I apologize for anyone this might offend, she's a very opinionated woman, refers to this kind of situation as white men saving brown women from brown men. But again, sort of making the point of, from her perspective, maybe we don't want your help. Now, that's not universally true, though. So scholars, when we talk about this, and political scientists and cultural scholars, it's a very, very complex set of situations. And so the public perception of these photos, regardless of what the article is about inside the magazine, is really interesting. Also interesting to discover that she's not just Afghani, but she's an Afghan refugee, meaning she left her home. So it's just food for thought. I try not to come down on one side of this argument or the other, but just to point out that it's a very complex situation. Okay, veiling in the United States. Why would a woman choose to wear a veil in the US where it's not very common? Sometimes we have a lot of American Muslim women who do indeed believe that the veil is mandated by God. They read that Quranic passage, and that's what they read, and that's what they believe. Sometimes a woman will wear a veil in the United States as a sign of solidarity or resistance with other Muslims. And if they feel like their community is being oppressed or is being misapprehended, they may wear a veil for that reason. And then some, just like anywhere else, would don a veil because it's a family tradition. It's what's expected in their community. Why would U.S. women who are Muslim not wear a veil? Because they don't believe it is a requirement of their religion. Many of these women report that they are merely exhausted at having to explain themselves to others. I've known a number of women throughout my life who are Anglo women who marry a Muslim man and choose to don a veil, and they are probably more apt to have to explain themselves over and over again because people just don't understand. And then some women choose not to wear the veil just because they don't want to stand out. It's not anything to do with the I want to explain it or I don't want to explain it. It's just that I don't want to, stand out and wear my religion on my head. So the Islamic Society of North America has among its membership a mix of women, some of whom wear veils and some of whom don't. But the women who do wear veils have been able to rise to positions of power in that organization. So some of those women are making that choice because they want to be leaders within a Muslim organization in the United States, and it is easier to do that if they don traditional dress. And they feel that is, even if they thought it was a personal sacrifice, and most of them wouldn't define it that way, but even if they did, they would say it's worth it for the fact that now you've got a woman in a leadership position, and that sends a more powerful message than if they're not wearing a veil and they're stuck in that lower tier in the organization. And as Islamist definitions become more and more prevalent in the West, and many American Muslim women don't feel affinity with those views, they begin to question whether they should wear hijab as well. Leila Ahmed, who's an Egyptian-American scholar, says they perhaps begin to wonder if they are in fact Muslim after all, if this is Islam. So if the predominant media picture of Islam is a terrorist, radicalized, ultra-conservative community, and then a woman feels that if I wear a hijab, that's what people are going to think of me, or that is what Islam has now become, then I don't want to be that Islam to me means something else, and it's not really about whether I have a veil on or not. Pamela Taylor, an American convert to Islam, said, I started wearing hijab as a clear statement that I did not want to be judged by my body, my beauty, or lack thereof, but as an individual, for my personality, my character, and my accomplishments. It was for me an unambiguous rejection of the objectification of women by men, by advertisers, by the beauty and fashion industries, and Hollywood. Okay, so she's, again, taking it on as a symbol of I'm fighting back against this whole societal structure. My choice to, she goes on to say, my choice to wear a headscarf was essentially the most dramatic, provocative, feminist statement I could make in my personal life, an in-your-face rebellion against the feminine mystique. It's perhaps not a real prevalent voice, but I think it's a really important one. That she's saying, I'm choosing to do this, and I'm choosing to do it for a very specific reason, and I do indeed feel empowered by this choice in a way that we wouldn't necessarily assume. Yasmin Ali-Bhai Brown, who's a British journalist and self-described, I love this description of herself, lefty, liberal, anti-racist, feminist, Shia Muslim, part Pakistani, and a very responsible person, does not wear the veil. She says, I am but Muslim light, a nonconformist believer who will not be told what and how by sanctimonious religious sentinels for whom religion is a long list of rules to be obeyed by bovine followers, So clearly a very politicized woman as well. But she's choosing not to wear the veil because she feels that that also empowers her. So two sides, two different choices, two different women for the same reason. Another really interesting phenomenon that we have seen, I just saw this, I think it was last year. A Muslim designer participated for the first time in New York Fashion Week. So some of you may have seen this photo or some others like it. This idea, if we're going to wear veils, we don't have to wear a black tent. If the point is being modest in terms of covering your shape or covering your hair, there's a way to do that and still be stylish. So now Pamela Taylor wouldn't like that because she's saying, well, I'm trying to protest against the fashion industry, and here's the fashion industry embracing this new market of American Muslim women who want to wear hijab but want to be a little bit more fashion forward, if we would say. So what does the veil mean? There are almost as many answers to this as there are women that you could ask. To Malika Masood, the Muslim veil is full of meaning. She says, at any given period of history, time, or place, the idea and practice of veiling have led to clashing viewpoints. Inclusion, exclusion, progressive, regressive, emancipating, humiliating, erotic, vulgar, trendy, the list goes on and on. One of the most contentious debates in some analytical circles underlies the assumption that feminists oppose the veil and anti-feminists don't. Again, the assumption. Michelle Auerbach, who's a Jewish writer who has also covered her hair at times. The problem is that a symbol means exactly what society thinks it means, no more, no less. So when we talk about the meaning of the veil, there's the meaning that the woman who is wearing the veil gives to that piece of cloth. And then there's the meaning that all the rest of us give to that piece of cloth. And if you're an English professor like I am, then you start thinking about, well, then what does it really mean, right? Because meaning has so many different permutations. Throughout history, men in power have sexualized, theologized, and politicized women's hair. I mean, that's really what it gets down to. I mean, there's modest dress in general, but a lot of it is just about the hair. And we turn that, whether we cover it or not, how we wear it, how we style it, whether we have long hair, short hair, all of that becomes politicized, sexualized, symbolized in various ways. So some of the meanings that we ascribe to veils have forced women into hypocritical stances, such as the burkini, which is not, you don't see her skin, but you certainly see her shape, right? It's kind of like, it reminds me of the bathing costumes of the 20s, you know, that kind of thing. Here's the slide I was talking about that we used to advertise this. So on the one hand, veiling is supposed to be something that makes you kind of disappear into the background so people don't notice you. But if you want to make a statement, she really has made up her eyes. And one could argue that this makes looking at her, at least in a photo like this, even more provocative. Right? We start asking questions. Another scholar quoted, not just talking about the burkini, but refers to what we see sometimes in modern Muslim countries today. This one is referring to Egypt. Giggly Egyptian debutantes in hip-hugging jeans, black spandex tops, with matching lacy headscarves. So it makes saying, oh, yeah, I'm wearing a veil, got my hair covered, it's fine, but if the rest of the outfit doesn't quite go along with that, it isn't consistent, then is that someone being creative, or is that someone really being hypocritical? Then we go back to the reasons why she's doing it. Is she doing it for religious reasons, or is she, like Catholic schoolgirls in this country, doing it because the family said, I mean, I don't know how many of you know, I knew many in my childhood, grew up Catholic, and I didn't go to Catholic school, but many of my friends did. And as soon as you leave the house, you roll up the skirt, and do that kind of thing. Or then you roll it back down when you get into school because the nuns are going to measure it. And then when you leave again, you roll it back up. So women the world over have been finding ways to defy rules and regulations about dress. And Muslim women are doing the same thing. So in the end, I think it's a matter of choice. Whether we're going to talk about oppression or empowerment, if it's a choice, it can be empowering. If there's no choice, then it tends to be oppressive. Do women really have a choice anywhere? Whether in the US or London or Indonesia or Saudi Arabia, the veil means what others say it means. Women lose the luxury, oftentimes, of having their apparel mean whatever they want it to mean, and the veil over time has become a very easy symbol. Going back to Pamela Taylor, she said, "There are days when I am tired of the battles, when I feel demoralized to the point of wanting to abandon the scarf so that I might be invisible again, not a symbol or a pawn." And aren't we all veiled to some extent? Veiling is far more than a matter of women's body than surface debates. In some lands, it is a physical fabric. In others, it exists in makeup, married names, other masking practices. The veil is not one thing. It shapeshifts. The veil has many, many meanings. Think about other statements that people have made with clothing in the world. And I think about the Cultural Revolution in China, where men and women were wearing the same kind of Maoist, if you will, outfits. It was a statement. The Indian Revolution and the tradition to homespun, and comment against the British rule. When I used to go to the Modern Language Association conference and watch as we were all interviewing for jobs at universities, you wore a black suit if you were a woman, a black skirt suit. I personally didn't. I resisted, but most people did. That if you were going to be taken seriously as a female scholar in the 80s and 90s in the academy, you wore a black suit with a skirt. That's another type of veiling, masking, disguising. You're playing a role. And you're playing a role to feed into someone else's expectations about who you are, what you know, and what you can do. So, some of the cultures have gotten more proactive. This is a new show in Pakistan. Burqa Avengers. Avenger, rather. And for those of you who can't see this kind of small photo here in the corner on the bottom, don't mess with the lady in black. All right? This is a multi-award winning 3D animated TV series. And it's the first ever animated superhero TV series made in Pakistan. The protagonist of the show is Jia, and she is a school teacher by day, whose alter ego is the superheroine Burqa Avenger. Her use of books and pens as weapons is symbolic on many levels, and really it's an argument toward the education of women. But she fights for justice, peace, and education for all. So, to wrap up, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to read you another poem by Mojakov, but I also want to give you a quotation from Sharifa Zuhur, who is a member of the Egyptian Socialist Labor Party, and to me, this sums up so much. What's in a woman's head is a lot more important than what's on it. So, one more poem because I'm an English professor and that's what we do. Hijab, scene number 7. No, I'm not bald under the scarf. No, I'm not from that country where women can't drive cars. No, I would not like to defect. I'm already American, but thank you for offering. What else do you need to know relevant to my buying insurance? Opening a bank account, reserving a seat on a flight. Yes, I speak English. Yes, I carry explosives. They're called words. And if you don't get up off of your assumptions, they're going to blow you away. Thank you very much.
There's another perspective, because I do practice veiling. I never really thought about it that way. I'm from here. I'm born in the United States. And I'm also not a member of any religious order or tradition that practices veiling, at least for the last few hundred years. And I practice veiling really in a practical way. I've always been kind of a wanderer. I love to walk. I love to walk alone. I'm often found in places where it's not thought of as safe to be outside, especially at night, especially as a woman alone. And I have always thought, well, if I can watch out for myself and make sure that I'm okay, it should be okay. And one of the ways that I've found to make that safe is to practice veiling. And so instead of saying, no, I won't go there, it's not safe, I'm a woman, I shouldn't be outside alone, I found that by covering my hair, and this is like kind of like veiling light, you can still see my hair, right? It's tied up, it's not loose, but it's visible. But if I really want to be serious, and if I really want to go somewhere or be outside and not be harassed by men, not increase my danger of being assaulted, which is a real concern for women in every country, everywhere in the world, I completely cover my hair. I make myself a kind of turban, you know? You can't see anything. And I cover my breasts, right? I use the whatever you call it, right? Scarf. And I found that when I dress like this, nobody bothers me ever. I can go anywhere, any time of day or night, by myself, and I'm not at all restricted. And so I would also argue that women are always dealing with a level of restriction that doesn't have to do with what you're wearing, right? But just what is expected is okay and not okay, you know?
And you choose to do it the way you do, and
right.
People
so
make other choices.
People may not even be realizing that, there is a kind of oppression, like, because I'm a girl, because I'm outside, because I'm alone. You know what I mean? This is actually not acceptable. It's so unacceptable that you don't even think about it. It's just like, people don't do it, you know? So, there's another veiling story for you. Not all the time. Sometimes, whatever. Yeah.
Has questions? I'm happy to hang around if anyone wants to just ask me and share the question with the audience. So thank you so much for coming. Or question.